On April 18, 1962, Marilyn Monroe's voice was so fragile that a 40-piece orchestra stopped playing just to listen. Only her trembling voice remained. 2,500 people wept in absolute silence. The evening of April 18, 1962, was supposed to be just another charity performance. Chicago Symphony Hall, 2,500 seats sold out. Black tie affair for the Children's Hospital Fund. Marilyn Monroe was scheduled for a simple 15-minute set, 3 songs, bow exit. Nobody expected what would become the most haunting performance in entertainment history. Backstage at 8:47 p.m., Marilyn stood before her dressing room mirror, hands shaking as she applied her signature red lipstick. Her accompanist, James Morrison, had been working with her for 3 years, but he'd never seen her this nervous. "Miss Monroe," he whispered, "the orchestra is ready whenever you are." She turned to him and her eyes held something he'd never seen before. Not stage fright, but a kind of desperate vulnerability. "Jimmy," she said, her voice barely audible, "what if they hear the real me tonight?" At 9:15 p.m., the house lights dimmed. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra, 40 of the city's finest musicians, struck the opening chords of Summertime. The curtain rose, and there she stood, Marilyn Monroe in a simple black dress, no sequins, no glamour, just a woman and a microphone. But the most haunting part was yet to come. She opened her mouth to sing, and what emerged wasn't the breathy, sultry voice the world knew. It was something else entirely, raw, unfiltered, trembling with an emotion so pure it seemed to pierce through the very air of the concert hall. Wait. This single detail changes everything you thought you knew about Marilyn. By the third note, something extraordinary began to happen. First violin, Sarah Chen, later described a moment. "I was playing the accompaniment when I heard, not Marilyn Monroe, the star, but this wounded human being. My bow slowed, then stopped. I just had to listen." One by one, the orchestra members began to fall silent. The cellist stopped mid-phrase. The woodwinds faded away. The brass section lowered their instruments. Even the conductor, Leonard Martinez, let his baton fall to his side and simply watched as Marilyn's voice filled the vast space, completely alone. The audience thought they'd seen it all. But then something magical happened. In that cavernous hall, with its perfect acoustics, designed for symphonies, Marilyn's unadorned voice became something transcendent. Every crack in her tone, every breath between words, every tremor of emotion was amplified and laid bare for 2,500 people to witness. She sang Summertime, but not the way Gershwin had written it. She sang it like a woman who had never experienced a peaceful summer, who had never known the easy living the song promised. Her voice broke on "Your Daddy's Rich," because everyone in that room knew her daddy had never been there at all. "Stop. What you're about to hear changes everything you thought you knew." By the second verse, people in the audience began to weep. Not polite tears, but the kind of deep, silent sobbing that comes from recognizing your own pain reflected back at you. Dorothy Walsh, a Society columnist covering the event, wrote the next day, "I came to see Marilyn Monroe perform. Instead, I witnessed a soul being stripped bare." The orchestra members sat motionless, their instruments forgotten. Some had tears streaming down their faces. The concertmaster, David Liu, later said, "In 30 years of professional music, I had never heard anything so honest. It was like she was singing directly to each person's secret wounds." But here's what made it truly extraordinary. Marilyn seemed unaware that the orchestra had stopped playing. She was lost in the song, in her memories, in whatever private pain she was finally allowing the world to see. Her eyes were closed, her hand gripping the microphone stand like an anchor. Wait, the story gets even more incredible. When Summertime ended, the silence that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced in a concert hall. No one applauded, no one moved. 2,500 people sat in complete stillness, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever sacred moment they had just witnessed. Marilyn opened her eyes and looked out at the audience. For a few seconds, she seemed confused by the absolute silence. Then she saw the faces, tear-streaked, raw, completely open. She saw the orchestra members, instruments down, looking at her with something between awe and heartbreak. And that's when she understood what had happened. The scheduled second song was I Wanna Be Loved by You, her signature bouncy number. But Marilyn looked at conductor Martinez and shook her head almost imperceptibly. Instead, she leaned into the microphone and in a voice barely above a whisper said, This one is for everyone who's ever felt alone." What followed was a version of Over the Rainbow that nobody who was there would ever forget. If summertime had been raw, this was devastating. She sang it like a woman who had spent her entire life looking for that place over the rainbow, that somewhere where troubles melted like lemon drops, and had finally realized it didn't exist. But the most haunting part was yet to come. Halfway through Over the Rainbow, Marilyn's voice began to crack, not from poor technique, but from the sheer weight of emotion. She tried to continue, but the words somewhere, over the rainbow, skies are blue came out as barely a whisper. The audience held its breath. Here was the world's most famous woman, completely vulnerable, struggling to finish a song that had become too painful to sing. That's when something unprecedented happened. Someone in the balcony, a middle-aged man later identified as Robert Chen, a factory worker who had saved for months to afford the ticket, stood up and began to sing with her. His voice, untrained but warm, joined hers on And the Dreams That You Dare to Dream Really Do Come True. Within seconds, others joined in. Then dozens, then hundreds. Soon, all 2,500 people in Chicago Symphony Hall were singing Over the Rainbow, with Marilyn Monroe, their voices blending in a chorus of shared hope and shared pain. Marilyn looked out at the sea of faces, all singing with her, and for the first time in the entire performance, she smiled. Not her famous smile, not the Hollywood smile, but something real and grateful and beautiful. The song ended with 2,500 voices fading into silence. Marilyn stood at the microphone for a long moment, tears streaming down her face, looking out at an audience that had become, for one night, a family. Then she whispered into the microphone, "Thank you for letting me be human." The ovation that followed lasted 12 minutes, but it wasn't the usual show business applause. It was something deeper. Recognition, gratitude, love. People stood and clapped not for Marilyn Monroe the star, but for the broken, beautiful human being who had just shared her soul with them. Backstage afterward, Marilyn sat in her dressing room, still in the simple black dress, makeup streaked with tears. James Morrison, her accompanist, knocked softly on the door. "Miss Monroe, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever been part of." She looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there in 3 years of working together. "Jimmy," she said, "I think that's the first time I've ever really sung. But here's the detail that will break your heart." 3 months and 18 days later, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home. The Chicago performance was never officially recorded. There were no studio microphones, no professional recording equipment. The only record of that extraordinary night exists in the memories of the 2,500 people who were there. Orchestra member Sarah Chen kept the program from that night for the rest of her life. Before she died in 2003, she gave an interview to the Chicago Tribune. "People always ask what made Marilyn special. It wasn't her beauty, it wasn't her fame. It was that one night when she let us see her real heart. And it was the most beautiful thing I ever witnessed." The man who started the sing-along, Robert Chen, never spoke publicly about the experience until 1987, 25 years later. When asked why he stood up and began singing, he said, "She looked so alone up there. Nobody should have to carry that much pain by themselves." Today, Chicago Symphony Hall has a small plaque in the lobby, in memory of the evening when music reminded us of our shared humanity. Most people who pass it have no idea what it refers to. But the 2,500 people who were there that night, those who are still alive, they remember. They remember the night Marilyn Monroe stopped being a star and became for one precious evening simply human. And perhaps that's the greatest performance of all, not pretending to be someone else, but having the courage to be exactly who you are. Broken parts and all, in front of 2,500 strangers who turned into family simply by listening. That's the night the orchestra fell silent, and a wounded woman's voice became the most beautiful sound in the world. But wait, there's something else about that night that nobody talks about. After the performance, as the audience slowly filed out of Chicago Symphony Hall, many lingered in the lobby. They didn't want to leave. They didn't want to return to their regular lives. After witnessing something so profound, small groups formed, strangers talking to strangers about what they had just experienced. Margaret Foster, a 67-year-old widow from Oak Park, approached Robert Chen, the man who had started the sing-along. "Thank you," she whispered, tears still fresh on her cheeks. "My husband died 6 months ago, and I haven't sung a note since his funeral. Tonight I found my voice again." The story gets even more extraordinary. 3 weeks after the performance, Chicago Symphony Hall began receiving letters. Hundreds of them. People writing to share how that evening had changed their lives. A businessman who had been planning suicide wrote that hearing Marilyn's vulnerable voice made him realize he wasn't alone in his pain. A mother estranged from her daughter for 5 years wrote that the experience inspired her to make the phone call that would heal their relationship. The Hall's general manager, William Davidson, kept every single letter in a special file. By December 1962, there were over 800 letters, each one describing a personal transformation that began that April evening. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. Among those letters was one that arrived on August 7, 1962, 2 days after Marilyn's death. It was postmarked August 4, the day she died. The letter was from Marilyn herself. In her delicate handwriting, she had written, "Dear friends at Chicago Symphony Hall, I wanted you to know that April 18th was the first time in my life I felt truly seen. Not as Marilyn Monroe, but as Norma Jean, the girl who was always too scared to sing in front of others. You gave me the gift of acceptance, and I will treasure that night forever. With all my love, Marilyn." The letter was delivered to William Davidson's office. He read it 3 times before the full weight of it hit him. This was Marilyn's last written communication to the world, composed on the day of her death, reflecting on a performance that had meant everything to her. The most heartbreaking part? She had mailed it herself. Security footage from the Beverly Hills post office, discovered years later, shows Marilyn Monroe at 2:17 p.m. on August 4, 1962, dropping a single envelope into the mail slot. She was wearing dark sunglasses and a simple white dress. It was the last time she was seen in public. Davidson framed the letter and hung it in his office, but the story spread throughout the Chicago music community. Musicians who had played that night found themselves forever changed by the experience. Leonard Martinez, the conductor, later said in interviews, "I've conducted symphonies for presidents, for royalty, for the world's elite, but nothing will ever compare to the moment when Marilyn Monroe's naked truth filled our hall and reminded us all why music exists." The ripple effects of that evening continued for decades. Sarah Chen, the first violinist who stopped playing, went on to establish a music therapy program for trauma survivors, directly inspired by what she witnessed that night. "Marilyn showed me that sometimes the most healing thing you can do is simply listen," Chen explained in a James Morrison, Marilyn's accompanist, never performed professionally again after her death. "How do you follow perfection?" he asked. Instead, he became a music teacher in inner-city Chicago, working with children who, like Marilyn, had experienced profound loss and abandonment. Even more remarkable was what happened to Robert Chen, the factory worker who started the sing-along. His act of spontaneous compassion that night launched an unexpected friendship with several audience members. They began meeting monthly, calling themselves the Rainbow Circle, to check on each other's well-being and offer support during difficult times. The group continued meeting for 43 years, until the last surviving member, Dorothy Walsh, the Society columnist who had covered the event, passed away At her funeral, the remaining members sang Over the Rainbow in the same gentle, healing way they had learned from Marilyn that April night. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of all was what happened to the children. Several families had brought teenagers to the concert that night, thinking they were taking them to see a glamorous Hollywood star. Instead, those young people witnessed the most honest display of human vulnerability they had ever seen. 16-year-old Michael Torres, who attended with his parents, later became a therapist, specializing in helping performers deal with anxiety and depression. Marilyn showed me that strength isn't about hiding your pain, he said. It's about sharing it in a way that helps others feel less alone. Jennifer Walsh, Dorothy's teenage granddaughter who was in the audience, became a documentary filmmaker. Her 1987 film The Night Music Stood Still featured interviews with surviving audience members, each sharing how Marilyn's performance had shaped their understanding of authenticity and compassion. The documentary was never widely released. The family felt it was too sacred to commercialize. But it's preserved in the Chicago History Museum, a testament to one extraordinary evening when entertainment became healing. Here's the detail that will absolutely astound you. In 1999, a restoration project at Chicago Symphony Hall uncovered something remarkable in the building's acoustic design. Hidden microphones, installed in 1960 for acoustic testing purposes, had been accidentally recording performances. Among the forgotten reels in a storage basement was one labeled April 18. The recording existed after all. William Davidson's son, now managing the hall, faced an impossible decision. Should this deeply personal, sacred moment be preserved for history, or should it remain in the memory of those who were present? After consulting with surviving audience members and Marilyn's estate, they decided to digitally preserve the recording, but never release it publicly. It sits in a climate-controlled vault, marked simply, for future generations to understand the power of human connection. But here's what makes the recording even more extraordinary. Audio engineers who cleaned up the tape discovered something that the live audience couldn't hear. Marilyn was quietly crying throughout the entire performance. The microphones picked up sounds that human ears couldn't detect. The soft intake of breath between sobs, the gentle tremble in her voice that spoke of years of hidden pain finally being released. Dr. Marcus Webb, the audio engineer who restored the recording, later wrote, "I've worked on recordings of every major artist of the 20th century, but listening to Marilyn that night, hearing the layers of emotion in her voice that technology revealed, it was like discovering a lost psalm of human experience." The final devastating truth about that April evening only came to light in 2010, when Marilyn's personal effects were being catalogued for a museum exhibition. Among her belongings was a small diary entry from April 18, 1962. "Tonight I sang without pretending. For the first time in my life I let people hear my real voice. And they didn't run away. Maybe I'm not as broken as I thought. Maybe broken things can still be beautiful." It was her last diary entry, expressing hope. The musicians who played that night, those who are still living, gather every April 18th at Chicago Symphony Hall. Not for a formal ceremony, but simply to sit quietly in the space where they witnessed something that defied explanation. Leonard Martinez, now in his 90s, still attends these informal remembrances. "We don't talk much," he explains. "We just sit and remember the night, when music reminded us what it means to be human." And in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it again, the voice that was strong enough to silence an orchestra and gentle enough to heal a broken world.